Hi, I am Anna. This is my sister Lydia. This is my brother
Malachi.
And today we are starting on chapter 3 of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. This is Bopbaw, our Bopbaw.
Yes.
And so, I guess we're ready.
All right. Chapter 3, Edmund and the Wardrobe. Lucy ran out of the empty room into the passage and found the other three. "It's all right," she repeated. "I've come back." Why, said Lucy. What on earth are you talking about, Lucy? Asked Susan. "Why," said Lucy in amazement, "haven't you all been wondering where I was?" "So you've been hiding, have you?" said Peter. "Poor old Lou, hiding and nobody noticed. You'll have to hide longer than that if you want people to start looking for you." "But I've been away for hours and hours," said Lucy. All the others stared at one another. "Batty," said Edmund, tapping his head. "Quite batty." "What do you mean, Lou?" asked Peter. "What I said," answered Lucy. "It was just after breakfast when I went in the wardrobe, and I've been away for hours and hours. I had tea, and all sorts of things have happened." "Don't be silly, Lucy. It was just after breakfast." "No, don't be silly, Lucy," said Susan. "We've only just come out of that room a moment ago, and you were there then." "She's not being silly at all," said Peter. "She's just making up a story for fun, aren't you, Lou? And why shouldn't she?" "No, Peter, I'm not at all," she said. "It's a magic wardrobe. There's a wood inside it, and it's snowing, and there's a faun and a witch, and it's called Narnia. Come and see." "No, Peter, I'm not," she said. No, I'm sorry." The others did not know what to think, but Lucy was so excited that they all went back with her into the room. She rushed ahead of them, flung the door open of the wardrobe, and cried, "Now, go in and see for yourselves." "Why, you goose," said Susan, putting her head inside and pulling the fur coats apart. "It's just an ordinary wardrobe. Look, there's the back of it." Then everyone looked in and pulled the coats apart, and they all saw, Lucy herself saw, a perfectly ordinary wardrobe. There was no wood, no snow, only the back of the wardrobe with hooks on it. Peter went in and rapped his knuckles on it to make sure that it was solid. "A jolly good hoax, Lou," he said as he came out again. "You have really taken us in, I must admit. We half believed you." "But it wasn't a hoax at all," said Lucy. "Really and truly, it was all different a moment ago. Honestly, it was, I promise." "Come, Lou," said Peter. "That's going a bit far. You've had your joke. Haven't you better drop it now?" Lucy grew very red in the face and tried to say something, though she hardly knew what she was trying to say, and burst into tears. And for the next few days, she was very miserable. She could have made it up with the others quite easily at any moment if she could have brought herself to say that the whole thing was only a story made up for fun. But Lucy was a very truthful girl, and she knew that she was really in the right, and she could not bring herself to say this. The others, who thought she was telling a lie, and a silly lie too, made her very unhappy. The two elder ones did this without meaning to do it, but Edmund could be spiteful, and on this occasion he was spiteful. He sneered and jeered at Lucy and kept on asking her if she'd found any other new countries and other cupboards all over the house. What made it worse was that these days ought to have been delightful. The weather was fine, and they were out of doors from morning to night, bathing, fishing, climbing trees, and lying in the heather. But Lucy could not properly enjoy any of it. And so things went on until the next wet day. And that day, when it came to the afternoon, and there was no sign of a break in the weather, they decided to play hide and seek. Susan was it. And as soon as the others scattered to hide, Lucy went to the room where the wardrobe was. She did not mean to hide in the wardrobe because she knew that would only set the others talking in about the whole wretched business. But she did want to have one more look inside of it, for by this time she was beginning to wonder herself whether Narnia and the faun had been a dream. The house was so large and complicated and full of hiding places that she thought She would have time to look, to have one look in the wardrobe and then hide somewhere else. But as soon as she reached it, she heard steps in the passage outside, and then there was nothing for it but to jump into the wardrobe and hold the door closed behind her. She did not shut it properly because she knew that it is very silly to shut oneself into a wardrobe, even if it's not a magic one. Now the steps she had heard were those of Edmund, and he came into the room just in time to see Lucy vanishing into the wardrobe. He at once decided to get into it himself, not because he thought it a particularly good place to hide, because he wanted to go on teasing her about her imaginary country. He opened the door, and there were coats hanging up as usual, and the smell of mothballs and darkness and silence, and no sign of Lucy. She thinks I'm Susan come to catch her, said Edmund to himself, so she's keeping very quiet at the back. He jumped in and shut the door, forgetting what a very foolish thing this is to do. And then he began feeling about for Lucy in the dark. He'd expected to find her in a few seconds and was very surprised when he did not. He decided to open the door again and let in some light, but he could not find the door either. He didn't like this at all, and he began groping wildly in every direction and even shouted out, "Lucy, Lou, where are you? I know you're here." There was no answer, and Edmund noticed that his own voice had a curious sound. Not the sound you would expect in a cupboard, but a kind of open air sound. He also noticed that he was unexpectedly cold, and then he saw a light. "Thank goodness," said Edmund. "The door must have swung open of its own accord." He forgot all about Lucy and went toward the light, which he thought was the open door of the wardrobe. But instead of finding himself stepping out into the spare room, he found himself stepping out from the shadow of some thick, dark fir trees into an open place in the middle of a wood. There was a crisp, dry snow under his feet and more snow lying on the branches of the trees. And overhead there was a pale blue sky, the sort of sky one sees on a fine winter day in the morning. Straight ahead of him, he saw between the tree trunks the sun, just rising, very red and clear. Everything was perfectly still, as if he were the only living creature in that country. There was not even a robin or a squirrel among the trees, and the wood stretched as far as he could see in every direction. He shivered. He now remembered that he had been looking for Lucy, and also how unpleasant he had been to her about her imaginary country, which now turned out not to have been imaginary at all. He thought that she must be somewhere quite close. So he shouted, "Lucy, Lucy, I'm here too, Edmund." There was no answer. "She's angry about all the things I've been saying lately," thought Edmund. And though he did not like to admit that he'd been wrong, he also did not much like being alone in this strange, cold place. So he shouted again, "I say, Lou, I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I see now that you were right all along. Do come out, make it, Pax." Still there was no answer. "Just like a girl," said Edmund to himself, sulking somewhere, "and won't accept an apology." He looked around him again and decided he did not much like this place, and had almost made up his mind to go home when he heard very far off in the wood a sound of bells. He listened, and the sound came nearer and nearer, and at last there swept into sight a sledge drawn by 2 reindeer. The reindeer were about the size of Shetland ponies, and their hair was so white that even the snow hardly looked white compared with them. Their branching horns were gilded and shone with something like fire when the sunrise caught them. Their harness was of scarlet leather and covered with bells. On the sledge, driving the reindeer, sat a fat dwarf who would have been about 3 feet high if he had been standing. He was dressed in polar bear's fur, and on his head he wore a red hood with a long gold tassel hanging down from its point. His huge beard covered his knees and served him instead of a rug, but behind him, on a much higher seat in the middle of the sledge, sat a very different person. A great lady, taller than any woman Edmund had ever seen. She was also covered in white fur up to her throat and held a long, straight golden wand in her right hand and wore a golden crown on her head. Her face was white, not merely pale, but white like snow or paper or icing sugar, except for her very red mouth. It was a beautiful face in other respects, but proud and cold and stern. The sledge was a fine sight as it came sweeping toward Edmund with the bells jingling and the dwarf cracking his whip and the snow flying up on each side of it. "Stop," said the lady, and the dwarf pulled the reindeer up so sharp that they almost sat down. And then they recovered themselves and stood champing their bits and blowing in the frosty air, the breath coming out of their nostrils, looking like smoke. "And what, pray, are you?" said the lady, looking hard at Edmund. My name's Edmund," said Edmund rather awkwardly. He did not like the way she looked at him. The lady frowned. "Is that how you address a queen?" she asked, looking more stern than ever. "I beg your pardon, your majesty, I didn't know," said Edmund. "Not know the Queen of Narnia?" cried she. "Ha! You shall know us better hereafter. But I repeat, what are you?" "Please, your majesty," said Edmund, "I don't know what you mean. I'm at school. At least I was. It's the holidays now." Chapter 4, Turkish Delight. "But what are you?" said the queen again. "Are you a great overgrown dwarf that has cut off its beard?" "No, your majesty," said Edmund. "I never had a beard. I'm a boy." "A boy," she said. "Do you mean that you are a son of Adam?" Edmund stood still, saying nothing. He was too confused by this time to understand what the question meant. "I see that you're an idiot, whatever else you may be," said the queen. "Answer me once and for all, or I shall lose my patience. Are you human?" "Yes, your majesty," said Edmund. "And how, pray, did you come to enter my dominions?" "Please, your majesty, I came in through a wardrobe." "A wardrobe? What do you mean?" I opened a door and just found myself here, your majesty," said Edmund. "Ha!" said the queen, speaking more to herself than to him. "A door. A door from the world of men. I've heard of such things. This may wreck all. But he is only one, and he is easily dealt with." And as she spoke these words, she rose from her seat and looked Edmund full in the face, her eyes flaming. And at the same moment, she raised her hand. Edmund felt sure that she was going to do something dreadful, but he seemed unable to move. And then, just as he gave himself up for lost, she appeared to change her mind. "Poor child," she said in quite a different voice, "look how cold you are. Come and sit with me here on the sledge, and I will put my mantle round you, and we will talk." Edmund did not like this arrangement at all, but he dared not disobey. He stepped onto the sledge and sat at her feet, and she put a fold of her fur mantle around him and tucked it well in. "Perhaps something hot to drink?" said the queen. "Should you like that?" "Yes, please, your majesty," said Edmund, whose teeth were chattering. The queen took from somewhere among her wrappings a very small bottle, which looked as if it were made of copper, and then holding out her arm, she let one drop fall from it onto the snow beside the sledge. And Edmund saw the drop for a second in midair, shimmering like a diamond. But the moment it touched the snow, there was a hissing sound, and there stood a jeweled cup full of something that steamed. The dwarf immediately took his hand, took this and handed it to Edmund with a bow and a smile. Not a very nice smile. Edmund felt much better as he began to sip the hot drink. It was something he had never tasted before, very sweet and foamy and creamy, and it warmed him right down to his toes. "It is dull, son of Adam, to drink without eating," said the queen presently. "What should you like to eat?" "Turkish delight, please, your majesty," said Edmund. The queen let another drop fall from her bottle onto the snow, and instantly there appeared a round box tied with green silk ribbon, which, when opened, turned out to contain several pounds of the best Turkish delight. Each piece was sweet and light to the very center, and Edmund had never tasted anything more delicious. He was quite warm now and very comfortable. And while he was eating, the queen kept asking him questions. At first, Edmund tried to remember that it is rude to speak with one's mouth full, but he soon forgot about this and thought only about trying to shove down as much Turkish delight as he could. And the more he ate, the more he wanted to eat, and he never asked himself why the queen would be so inquisitive. She got him to tell her that he had one brother and two sisters, and that one of the sisters had already been in Narnia and met a faun there, and that no one except himself and his brother and his sisters knew anything about Narnia. She seemed especially interested in the fact that there were four of them and kept on coming back to it. Are you sure there are just four of you? She asked. Two sons of Adam and two daughters of Eve, neither more nor less, said Edmund. And Edmund, with his mouth full of Turkish delight, kept on saying, yes, I told you that before, and forgetting to call her your majesty, but she didn't seem to mind now. At last, the Turkish delight was all finished, and Edmund was looking very hard at the empty box and wishing that she would ask him whether he would like some more. Probably the queen knew quite well what he was thinking, for she knew, though Edmund did not, that this was enchanted Turkish delight, and that anyone who had once tasted it would want more and more of it, and would even if they were allowed to go on eating it till they killed themselves. But she did not offer him any more. Instead, she said to him, Son of Adam, I should so much like to see your brother and two sisters. Will you bring them to see me? I'll try, said Edmund, still looking at the empty box. Because if you did come again, bringing them with you, of course, I'd be able to give you some more Turkish delight. I can't do it now. The magic will only work once. In my own house, it would be another matter. Why can't we go to your house now? Said Edmund. When he had first got onto the sledge, he had been afraid that she might drive away with him to some unknown place from which he would not be able to get back. But he had forgotten about that fear now. It is a lovely place, my house, said the queen. I am sure you would like it. There are whole rooms full of Turkish delight. And what's more, I have no children of my own. I want a nice boy who I could bring up as a prince and who would be king of Narnia when I am gone. While he was prince, he would wear a gold crown and eat Turkish delight all day long. And you are much the cleverest and handsomest young man I've ever met. I think I would like to make you the prince someday when you bring the others to visit me. Why not now, said Edmund. His face had become red and his mouth and fingers were sticky. He did not look either clever or handsome, whatever the queen might say. Oh, but if I took you there now, said she, I shouldn't see your brothers and your sisters. I want very much to know your charming relations. You are to be the prince, and later on the king. That is understood, but you must have courtiers and nobles. I will make your brother a duke and your sisters duchesses. There's something special about them, said Edmund. And anyway, oh, there's nothing special about them, said Edmund. And anyway, I could always bring them some other time. Ah, but once you're in my house, said the queen, you might forget all about them. You'd be enjoying yourself so much that you wouldn't want the bother of going to fetch them. No, you must go back to your own country now and come to me another day. With them, you understand. It's no good coming without them. But I don't even know the way back to my own country, pleaded Edmund. That's easy, answered the queen. Do you see that lamp? She pointed with her wand, and Edmund turned and saw the same lamp post under which Lucy had met the faun. Straight on beyond that is the way to the world of men. And now, look the other way. And there she pointed in the opposite direction. And tell me if you can see two little hills rising above the trees. I think I can, said Edmund. Well, my house is between those two hills. So the next time you come, you have only to find the lamppost and look for those two hills and walk through the wood till you reach my house. But remember, you must bring the others with you. I might have to be very angry if you came alone. I'll do my best, said Edmund. And by the way, said the queen, you needn't tell them about me. It would be fun to keep it a secret between us two, wouldn't it? Make it a surprise for them. Just bring them along to the two hills. Clever boy like you will easily think of some excuse for doing that. And when you come to my house, you could just say, let's see who lives here, or something like that. I'm sure that would be the best. If your sister has met one of the fawns, she may have heard strange stories about me, nasty stories that will make her afraid to come to me. Fawns will say anything, you know. And now, please, please, said Edmund suddenly, please, couldn't I have just one more piece of Turkish delight to eat on my way home? No, no, said the queen with a laugh. You must wait till next time. While she spoke, she signaled to the dwarf to drive on. But as the sledge swept away out of sight, the queen waved to Edmund, calling out, next time, don't forget, come soon. Edmund was still staring after the sledge when he heard someone calling his own name. And looking around, he saw Lucy coming toward him from another part of the wood. Oh, Edmund, she cried. You've got in too. Isn't it wonderful? And now, all right, said Edmund, I see you were right. It's a magic wardrobe after all. I'll say sorry if you like, but where on earth have you been all this time? I've been looking everywhere for you. If I'd known you had got in, I'd have waited for you, said Lucy, who was too happy and excited to notice how snappishly Edmund smoked or how flushed and strange his face was. I've been having lunch with dear Mr. Tumnus the fawn, and he's very well. And the White Witch has done nothing to him for letting me go. So he thinks she can't have found out. And perhaps everything is going to be all right after all. The White Witch, said Edmund. Who is she? She's a perfectly terrible person, said Lucy. She calls herself the Queen of Narnia, though she has no right to be queen at all. And all the fauns and dryads and naiads and dwarfs and animals, at least all the good ones, simply hate her. And she can turn people into stone and do all kinds of horrible things. And she has made a magic so that it is always winter in Narnia. Always in winter, but it never gets to Christmas. And she drives along on a sledge drawn by reindeer with her wand in her hand and a crown on her head. Edmund was already feeling uncomfortable from having eaten too many sweets, and when he heard that the lady he had made friends with was a dangerous witch, he felt even more uncomfortable. But he still wanted to taste that Turkish delight again, and more than he wanted anything else. Who told you all that stuff about the White Witch, he asked. Mr. Tumnus the fawn, said Lucy. You can't always believe what fawns say, said Edmund, trying to sound as if he knew far more about them than Lucy. Who said so? Asked Lucy. Everyone knows it, said Edmund. Ask anybody you like. But it's pretty poor sport standing here in the snow. Let's go home. Yes, let's, said Lucy. Oh, Edmund, I am glad you've got in too. The others will have to believe in Narnia now that both of us has been here. What fun it will be. But Edmund secretly thought that it would not be good fun for him as for her. He would have to admit that Lucy might have been right before all the others. He felt sure the others would be all on the side of the fawns and the animals, but he was already more than half on the side of the witch. He did not know what he would say or how he would keep his secret once they were all talking about Narnia. By this time, they had walked a good way, and then suddenly they felt coats around them instead of branches, and the next moment, they were both standing outside the wardrobe in the empty room. I say, said Lucy, you do look awful, Edmund. Don't you feel well? I'm all right, said Edmund, but this was not true. He was feeling very sick. Come on then, said Lucy, let's find the others. What a lot we shall have to tell them, and what wonderful adventures we shall have now that we're all in it together. Chapter 5, back on this side of the door. Because the game of hide and seek was still going on, it took Edmund and Lucy some time to find the others, but when they were all together, which happened in the long room where the suit of armor was, Lucy burst out, Peter, Susan, it's all true. Edmund has seen it too. There's a country you can get to through the wardrobe. Edmund and I both got in. We met one another in there in the wood. Go on, Edmund, tell them about it. What's all this about, Ed? Said Peter. And now we come to one of the nastiest things in the story. Up to that moment, Edmund had been feeling sick and sulky and annoyed with Lucy for being right, but he hadn't made up his mind what to do. When Peter suddenly asked him the question, he decided all at once to do the meanest and most spiteful thing he could think of. He decided to let Lucy down. Tell us, Ed, said Susan. And Edmund gave a very superior look as if he were far older than Lucy. There was really only a year's difference. And then a little snigger and said, oh, yes, Lucy and I have been playing, pretending that all her story was about a country in the wardrobe is true. Just for fun, of course. There's nothing there, really. Poor Lucy gave Edmund one look and rushed out of the room. Edmund, who was becoming a nastier person every minute, thought that he had scored a great success and went on at once to say, there she goes again. What's the matter with her? That's the worst of young kids. They always, look here, said Peter, turning on him savagely. Shut up. You've been perfectly beastly to Lou ever since she started this nonsense about the wardrobe, and now you go on playing games with her about it and sitting her off again. I believe you did it simply out of spite. But it's all nonsense, said Edmund, very taken aback. Of course it's all nonsense, said Peter. That's just the point. Lou was perfectly all right when we left home, but since we've been down here, she seems to be either going queer in the head or else turning into a frightful liar. But whatever it is, whichever it is, what good do you think you'll do by jeering and nagging at her one day and encouraging her the next? I thought, said Edmund, but he couldn't think of anything to say. You didn't think anything at all, said Peter. It's just spite. You've always liked being beastly to anyone smaller than yourself. We've seen you at school before now. So stop it, said Susan, and don't make things any better. It won't make things any better having a row between you two. Let's go find Lucy. It was not surprising that when they found Lucy a good deal later, everyone could see that she'd been crying. Nothing they could say to her made any difference. She stuck to her story and said, I don't care what you think, and I don't care what you say. You can tell the professor, or you can write to Mother, or you can do anything you like. I know I've met a fawn in there, and I wish I'd stayed there. And you are all beasts, beasts. It was an unpleasant evening. Lucy was miserable, and Edmund was beginning to feel that his plan wasn't working as well as he had expected. The two older ones were really beginning to think that Lucy was out of her mind. They stood in the passage talking about it in whispers long after they had gone to bed. The result was the next morning they decided that they really would go and tell the whole thing to the professor. He'll write to Father, and if he thinks there's really something wrong with Lou, said Peter, it's getting beyond us. So they went and knocked at the study door, and the professor said, come in, and got up and found chairs for them and said he was quite at their disposal. And then he sat listening to them with the tips of his fingers pressed together and never interrupting till they had finished the whole story. And after that, he said nothing for quite a long time, and then he cleared his throat and said the last thing either one of them expected. How do you know, he asked, that your sister's story is not true? Oh, but, began Susan, and then stopped. Anyone could see from the old man's face that he was perfectly serious. And then Susan pulled herself together and said, but Edmund said they had only been pretending. There's a point, said the professor, which certainly deserves consideration, very careful consideration. For instance, if you will excuse me for asking the question, does your experience lead you to regard your brother or your sister as more reliable? I mean, which is the more truthful? Well, that's just the funny thing about it, sir, said Peter. Up until now, I'd have said Lucy every time. And what do you think, my dear? Said the professor, turning to Susan. Well, said Susan, in general, I'd say the same as Peter. But this couldn't be true, all this about the wood and the fawn. That is more than I know, said the professor, and a charge of lying against someone whom you've always found truthful is a very serious thing. A very serious thing indeed. We're afraid it mightn't have been lying, said Susan. We thought there might be something wrong with Lucy. Madness, you mean? Said the professor quite coolly. Oh, you can make your minds easy about that one. One has only to look at her and talk to her to see that she's not mad. But then, said Susan, and stopped. She had never dreamed that a grown-up would talk like the professor and didn't know what to think. Logic, said the professor. to himself, why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only three possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, or she is mad, or she's telling the truth. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it's obvious that she's not mad. For the moment then, and unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she's telling the truth. Susan looked at him very hard and was quite sure from the expression on his face that he was not making fun of them. But how could it be true, sir? Said Peter. Why do you say that? Asked the professor. Well, for one thing, said Peter, if it was real, why doesn't everyone find this country every time they go in the wardrobe? I mean, there's nothing there when we looked. Even Lucy didn't pretend there was. What has that to do with it? Said the professor. Well, sir, if things are real, they're there all the time. Are they? Said the professor. And Peter did not quite know what to say. But there was no time, said Susan. Lucy had no time to have gone anywhere, even if there was such a place. She came running after us the very moment we were out of the room. It was less than a minute, and she pretended to have been away for hours. That is the very thing that makes her story so likely to be true, said the professor. If there really is a door in this house that leads to some other world, and I should warn you that this is a very strange house, and even I know very little about it. If I say she got into another world, I should not be surprised to find that the other world had a separate time of its own, so that however long you stayed there, it would never take up any of our time. On the other hand, I don't think many girls of her age would invent that idea for themselves. If she had been pretending, she would have hidden for a reasonable time before coming out and telling her story. But do you really mean, sir, said Peter, that there could be other worlds all over the place, just round the corner, like that? Nothing is more probable, said the professor, taking off his spectacles and beginning to polish them, while he muttered to himself, I wonder what they do teach at these schools. But what are we to do, said Susan. She felt the conversation was beginning to get off the point. My dear young lady, said the professor, suddenly looking up with very sharp expression at both of them, there is one plan which no one has yet suggested and which is well worth trying. What's that? Said Susan. We might all try minding our own business, said he, and that was the end of the conversation. After this, things were a great deal better for Lucy. Peter saw to it that Edmund stopped jeering at her, and neither she nor anyone else felt inclined to talk about the wardrobe at all. It had become a rather alarming subject, and so for a time it looked as if all the adventures were coming to an end, but that was not to be. The house of the professors, which even he knew so little about, was so old and famous that people from all over England used to come and ask permission to see over it. It was the sort of house that is mentioned in guidebooks and even in histories. And it might be, for all manner of stories were told about it, some of them even stranger than the one I'm telling you now. And when the parties of sightseers arrived and asked to see the house, the professor always gave them permission, and Mrs. Macready, the housekeeper, showed them around, telling them about the pictures and the armor and the rare books in the library. Mrs. Macready was not fond of children and did not like to be interrupted when she was telling the visitors all the things she knew. She had said to Susan and Peter almost on the first morning, along with a good many other instructions, and please remember you're to keep out of the way whenever I'm taking a party over the house. Just as if any of us would want to waste half the morning trailing around with a crowd of strange grown-ups, said Edmund, and the other three thought the same. This was how the adventures began for the second time. A few mornings later, Peter and Edmund were looking at the suit of armor and wondering if they could take it to bits, when the two girls rushed into the room and said, Look out, here comes the Macready with a whole gang with her. Sharp's the word, said Peter, and all four made off through the door at the far end of the room, but when they got into the green room and beyond it into the library, they suddenly heard voices ahead of them and realized that Mrs. Macready must be bringing her party of sightseers up the back stairs instead of up the front stairs as they had expected. And after that, whether it was that they lost their heads, or that Mrs. McCready was trying to catch them, or that some magic in the house had come to life and was chasing them into Narnia. They seemed to find themselves being followed everywhere until at last Susan said, "Oh, bother those trippers. Here, let's get into the wardrobe room till they've passed." No one will follow us there, but the moment they were inside, they heard voices in the passage and then someone fumbling at the door. And then they all saw the handle turning. "Quick," said Peter, "there's nowhere else," and flung open the wardrobe. All four of them bundled inside and sat there panting in the dark. Peter held the door closed but did not shut it, of course, for he remembered, as every sensible person does, that you should never, never shut yourselves up in a wardrobe. And that's the end for today.
Thank you, Bopbaw. Thank you, Bopbaw. Thank you,
Thank you, guys. I appreciate you listening. You're very attentive.
Guess what?
What,
Don't you
bud?
remember the witch who called herself a queen? Well, look, this is her house.
Oh, wow. So you've already imagined what her house looks like, and it looks like a castle that a queen would live in. That's cool.
Yeah, because she's a quote queen. And here's what I worked on. Here's my.
Oh, and you're using your special pen again. That's neat.
Hey, look.
I like the elf. I like the elf that you drew. That's cool. Neat.
Must be neat.